Brian, everybody, Brian is talking about the cow. So if you could start us off. Go. All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Continuous Discussions, the online forum where we talk about Agile, DevOps, and continuous delivery. I'm Sam Feld.
And I'm Anders Ahlgren. And today we're going to talk about software and pipeline architecture. Thank you. I have a long thing to read now. Software and pipeline architecture for DevOps, and especially about how they sort of fit together quite a bit. So the architecture of both your application and your delivery pipeline itself matters a lot, in all caps, often more than the specific technologies you choose to use. So we're going to talk about some of the proven architecture patterns, best practices to enable effective DevOps with architecture, and kind of some of the new and old technologies that we're using and how they maybe help or not help so much. And then talk a little bit also about how to future-proof things in the application and pipeline for what comes next.
Fantastic.
A small, tiny little topic.
Small, tiny little topic. And we're joined by quite a few, I won't say small or tiny for any of them. The brains on these folks are substantial. Brian Gracely, introduce yourself. And we spelled your name wrong, and I apologize. We'll fix that in post-production.
That's fine. Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, or good evening, wherever you're listening. My name is Brian Gracely. I'm Director of Product Strategy at Red Hat. For the OpenShift platform. I also host the Cloudcast podcast, which is a weekly show about cloud computing and DevOps and all those other fun things.
And the Pitmaster at the barbecue in North Carolina, which I've got to come and visit. Brian, welcome to the program. It's great to see you again. Carmen Diardo, good to see you as well. Introduce yourself.
Sure. So, hi, everybody. I'm Carmen Diardo. I'm a technology director at Nationwide Insurance, and I'm part of the DevOps leadership team where we're trying to accelerate our delivery capability for our business.
That sounds like a very noble goal, sir. Welcome to the program. It's great to see you again. Mark Imbriaco, always good to see you also. Introduce yourself.
Likewise. I'm Mark Imbriaco. I work at Pivotal Software, where I work with our enterprise customers who are trying to make these DevOps transformations and kind of help them understand from the trenches what that looks like, what that end state looks like when they get there, and some strategies of techniques they can apply from the places I've worked in the past, like GitHub, Heroku, and others. And it's always fun to be here.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for joining us. Mick Kirsten, our favorite CEO from TaskTop. Welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm the co-founder and CEO of TaskTop. This topic is super interesting to me. I've been writing a book working with people like Carmen on the topic of value stream architecture. So the book is called Project to Product, and it's really all around how we need to align these things to succeed in large-scale digital transformations or not. So.
Absolutely. That sounds fantastic. And when is that expected to publish, Mick? We should put a link to it on our blog or whatever. When is that going to be published?
In the fall.
In the fall. Right on. All right. Well, that's exciting. And last but not least, Randy Shoup, first time on the program. Welcome.
Thank you. My father would make me say Shoup because that is the pronunciation, but it's misspelled, so you're cool. Let's see. I worked at
double whammy. Apologies. Okay.
No worries. No, sorry. The name in English is misspelled. You spelled it properly. You spelled it how I spell it, but how I spell it is not how the Germans would correctly spell it. But that's neither here nor there.
Got it.
But let's talk technology. So I worked at eBay for a long time as the chief engineer. I ran engineering for Google App Engine. So that's Google's platform as a service where some of these ideas, were maybe introduced to the small number of people that, had great experience with App Engine. And then for the last 2 years, I've worked at Stitch Fix as the VP of engineering and put into practice a bunch of the things that we're going to talk about today.
Wonderful. All right. Well, like I said, some tremendous horsepower on the program today. Super happy to have you all with us. If you don't happen to be on the panel, and you'd know if you were on the panel because I would have asked you to introduce yourself, you can still be heard. Join us on Twitter, C9D9. But let's get started. We've got a lot of stuff to cover. Let's start with the big question of why does architecture matter, right? And let's start with Randy. Since you were the last one who spoke, you'll be the first one who speaks.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, architecture, as somebody said, is all the big decisions, all the decisions that are hard to change. And architecture matters because that is what helps us build all of our software. And in particular, I think we're going to talk about how to have an effective application architecture so that we can all move fast. I think that's our goal. We didn't really say it, but like we want to move fast and build things. And so a thing that I suspect that we'll talk about is not having one big monster thing, which we might call a monolith, but instead have maybe a bunch of smaller components. We could call those services. We might even call them microservices, but small, independently deployable components that align with particular teams and align with business, that the individual teams can all deploy.
So the architecture that you talked about, and you're breaking up a little bit, I'm not sure if that was us or you, but the architecture you talked about there, you talked about technical architecture, but you also talked about the team, right? So I guess that matters also?
Yes, so people are probably familiar with the idea of Conway's Law, that we essentially ship our org structure, or the fancier way to say it is our architecture is a reflection of the communication paths within our organization. And so you absolutely want the organization of your engineering team to mirror or to be congruent to your architecture. And I'll say that even more strongly, that if you want your architecture to be a certain way, you want to first organize your teams along those same lines. And so teams that are small, full stack teams that have a particular service or application or set of services and applications that they deploy and build, and then you form your whole system out of a combination of all of those.
Excellent, right on. All right, very good. Thank you, Randy. Nick, what are your thoughts on why does architecture matter?
Yeah, so I think it's been interesting as organizations have gone through a wave of agile transformations over the last decade, more recently a wave of DevOps transformations. The ones who sometimes have not had the successes they expected, I think we keep hearing them identify what the bottleneck was, what the impediment was, and of course culture is often an impediment. But what's so fascinating, if you just dig into the last State of DevOps survey, there's this interesting statement there that loosely coupled architectures and teams are the strongest predictor of continuous delivery, which it's maybe not surprising to some of us on this panel, but it really should be. It's the fact that a lot of effort goes into the transformations without the right kind of effort going to the architectures. And it's just very different, I think, Randy, for the companies that some of us have worked at, the kind of tech startups versus enterprise IT, where in tech startups you tend to have, and in digital natives, you tend to have architectures aligned to product lines. And so there will be a common set of APIs and a bit of an internal, open source model, or at least common APIs building and evolving as teams depend on each other, and those dependencies become kind of the key points of friction and delay. But I think that what we're seeing happen, especially in large enterprise IT, is that's absolutely not the starting point. And so these organizations are scrambling to determine, do we need to convert everything to microservices and containers tomorrow, or what do we do? And I think the problem is that we're, on the enterprise architecture side, we're looking at it backwards, and sometimes on the DevOps transformation side, we're looking at it backwards. And because one of the main things I've picked up from Carmen over the years is that any optimization of your value stream, of bringing business value to your customers to drive revenue results or customer engagement or NPS or something of that sort, any local optimization is probably bound to fail because you're not looking at end-to-end flow. So where we've been putting a lot of focus is looking at what does end-to-end value stream architecture look like. So we want to architect some of our value streams, Randy, you alluded to this, for time to market or for faster flow. We might want to architect some of our, some mainframe backend systems, older legacy systems, simply for reducing risk, and just not re-platform them, but make sure that we're dealing with the right kind of risk and security stories, and taking maybe down a little bit of technical debt as we wrap them in APIs or something. So I think that the key thing for me is that when you take an end-to-end value stream centric look at architecture and go away from this notion that the architecture, these large architectures, should be optimized for layering, for example, or for some future modular needs that you've got. Really, you want to optimize your value streams. Some of the value streams should be aligned to products, so to things that deliver value internally or externally. And then you look at architecting the software to optimize the future state of the value stream. And some value streams you absolutely want to optimize for time to market and basically very short lead times to getting features into customers' hands. If you're getting fancy to do A/B testing, if you're not, just to be able to make sure that you've got automated flow of feature delivery. Other value streams you optimize differently, as I mentioned, with reducing risk on those, or reducing technical debt, or reducing defects if it's a product that's been got low customer satisfaction. Or
value stream becomes a nice construct for you to be able to identify bottlenecks, identify waste, identify quality problems.
And so I'll leave it on that exactly, is that if we think of value stream architecture, we will solve whatever the problems are, because the problem could be a pipeline problem. If you don't have any continuous integration, continuous delivery, well, chances are that's going to be a bottleneck pretty quickly. But if you could have an upstream bottleneck if it's an end user facing application and you've got one UX designer for 60 developers, right? That could be a bottleneck as well. Or and I've seen this as I've been writing and interviewing people in these larger failed transformations. There'll be just hundreds of $millions poured into a transformation with these beautiful mobile and digital experiences created by the new chief digital officer or something, and the architecture in that organization could never support that. So it will just never work. While of course everything, the DevOps side is done, the front end amazing UX is done, and the organization's architecture will never support any of those experiences or any of that fast flow. So I think we're now at the point we have to look at the end-to-end architecture, and when we do, the actual software architecture for many organizations will be the bottleneck.
Yep, excellent. All right, Mick, that's fantastic. Thank you. You mentioned Carmen as being someone who you've learned a ton from. So Carmen, I'm going to bounce to you and ask you what else we can learn about why architecture matters.
Yeah, Mick's too kind. He's the big brain. I just try to help a little bit, but I had an interest. So here's kind of a dichotomy that we're living with. Right, we have 200 lines, agile lines. Okay, we started agile transformation over probably a dozen years ago, and we're starting to measure lead time, where we're measuring it from story card creation to deployment. So it's not quite as far, it's further than code commit, but it's not as far left as like customer idea, right? So we want to go further left. But so if I look across those 200 lines now, we have a couple lines that actually are almost doing single piece flow, where they can actually deploy almost story by story. And in fact, one of Mick's associates, Dominica DeGrandis, which Dominica, right? She works TaskTop now. She's actually visiting us for 3 days, so she's helping us we're giving her kind of a tour. And so one of the lines, we talked about, very much embedded with the business and can flow, has a very scalable architecture, right? They're not using microservices, but obviously they're decoupled and almost to the point, like I said, where they can do single piece flow. Now, we visited a line this morning, did a Gemba walk, and they were talking about the fact that they have stories that can sit for months, right, where they're done waiting for this is a case where their front end system, it's like a retirements plan area, where our back end, we still have the large back end record keepers. And even if they're not COBOL mainframe, they could be legacy Java, right? I mean, legacy now could be a lot of different technologies.
Yes.
And so
technology that you didn't implement is legacy technology, according to Anders.
Code I didn't write.
Or sometimes what I did implement. But anyway, the reason for that really is architectural, right? I mean, there's not a service available. There's not a loosely coupled capability. So they're sitting there with any of those cards that we're seeing that are sitting there 20, 30, 40, 50, I've seen cards sit 100 days while the line was done with them. Those are manifesting themselves as branches in the code base, if you go back. And that's manifesting itself as WIP, right? That's work in progress. That's slowing all the works down. And at its root there is architecture, right? Because we don't have the ability to decouple to dark launch, which is one of the key things on our journey that we want to get teams to do. So, you know, we see a wide dichotomy of it, and it's the same pipeline, a lot of the same capability, that the tooling is the same, right? So it's not as if one area is using something, you know, that's much cooler in a technology standpoint, right? It's architecture, and in some ways it's mindset. I don't even know, and you know, this isn't a criticism, right? Because we're all learning. Is do they really understand the implications of the fact that these things are sitting around? They are WIP, and there are methods where we could be moving this work out, even if it's not being deployed to the customer. At least it's moving out more quickly, and you have the ability to deliver more quickly. So
you work around it when you're trying to do other value-added work, and you can, like you said, if you can get the value out to your end user, ultimately that's the goal.
Right. So, you know, it is interesting, I think, that architecture, after kind of maybe being put on the back burner as you went through Agile, is coming front and center. Not that I think any of us realized it wasn't front and center, but I think there was a sense sometimes that it wasn't important. And it's essential if we're going to actually, you know, be able to improve our ability to be responsive.
Architecture and foundation matters. Talk to the folks who built the Millennium Tower here in San Francisco, right? So that's, you want to build on something that's very solid. So that's good. All right. Super, Carmen. That's great. Mr. Gracely.
Yes, sir. How you doing?
Your thoughts on I'm great. Why does architecture matter?
I think it matters in the context of, you know, at some point in time, you think you have an expectation of what, whether it's the flow is going to look like, what the business is going to look like. You know, look, at the end of the day, your architecture is trying to take a small group of people and trying to direct a large group of people to go do something, right? People don't respond terribly well to chaos. So architecture at the beginning of this is, you know, we have some perspective on where we think things are going to go. We think we have some perspective on what the next number of years are going to look like for the business. And this is generally the path that it looks like. You know, but at the same time, you know, architecture becomes just like code. It becomes, you know, a relic of whatever that thought process was at some point in time. You know, we admire and we sort of get excited about things like, oh, the architecture of Central Park or New York City or whatever. I'm sure there are people in New York right now that look at Central Park and go, you know, either they look at Central Park and go, that's a tremendous waste of space or whatever. They look at the giant cemeteries that you see driving in from JFK or LaGuardia and go, why in the world do I use that when we could use it so much more? Like, architecture is great at some point in time. The trick to it becomes, do you then take those behaviors that come out of those architectural decisions you make and make them scalable, right? That nothing is ever sort of fixed in time. It's you take a stab at it, you go drive towards something. But ultimately, if the architecture doesn't help create better behaviors, you know, it's as much a relic as old code.
Right. You need to have some good discipline and restraint when you're trying to figure out.
Absolutely.
Otherwise, you end up with a toilet right off the kitchen. Right.
Right.
A little foresight also helps with architecture.
As long as there's a door, I mean, you know.
Right. Well, and it's becoming harder and harder. I mean, you know, there's a great slide that I know, you know, Mark Embriaco's group. He's got Cornelia Davis throws up a slide all the time that says, look, in the last 50 years, these are the companies in the Fortune 500. In the last 10 years, these are the companies that have all changed. Those companies all thought they had all sorts of foresight, and the market changes on them. Right? They got wiped out by the iPhone, or they got wiped out by something else. Right? Foresight is great until, you know, you have to deal with reality.
Yeah. But leaving yourself the flexibility, the adaptability to be able to move the way the market moves with a good discipline and a good architecture is
it's important.
Super important. Absolutely. Thank you. All right, Mark. He just mentioned you, and you're the last one, so I'm going to let you go now.
Awesome. Yeah, to me, when I think about architecture, I think about the fact that when we talk about architecture, we're really talking about the fact that our systems are made up of a bunch of parts. And the interesting thing is not those parts individually. The interesting thing is how they connect together. So I think about boundaries and I think about interfaces. And when I think about architecture in terms of interfaces, it really drives a lot of behavior and decisions and capabilities and thought processes. Right, a great example. I think Mick was talking about making decisions and about, you have these processes and you have these policies. And if we don't think about architecture, if we build these tightly coupled systems, if we build these systems that have lots of components that are really deeply linked to one another, we often make these decisions and they're global, not because we think they need to be global, but because our system architecture requires that these decisions be made globally, even when we would choose, if we had thought about it in advance, to make different decisions for different parts of our systems, right? Maybe we need to be able to move faster on this part of the system. Maybe we want to be more careful on this other part. Maybe we require a little bit more compliance on this part. If we think about these interfaces and the behaviors, it lets us embrace the fact that it depends, right? It always depends. And I think that when you think about these interfaces, you can think about you can have real conversations about the expectations for behavior on both sides of the interface, and you can define that in a way that removes a lot of friction, that makes things work smoothly, that allows you to understand the motivations that came from both sides, right? We see this all the time. Different parts of large organizations are not optimizing towards the same goal, no matter how much we want them to, and they never will. That's just simple reality. We can wish all we want, but it's just not going to happen. But if we think in terms of these interfaces and we understand the motivations that are driving the person who produces the interface or the system on the other side of the interface, we're much more likely to be able to work together. So architecture is all about those boundaries and the interfaces between them and kind of what that enables us to do when we think about it.
I love that. And the idea that by just defining those interfaces and having a contract between those teams, then you give you enable those teams to make their own decisions about how they fulfill that contract, right?
Exactly.
You're empowering them to solve their business problem in the small while having an architecture that will span that whole flow, as you mentioned.
Well, and this is why I like value streams so much, the concept of value streams, because again, it's all about those interfaces and those boundaries between steps in the stream, right? That's really what we focus on.
Excellent. All right, Anders.
I think one of the interesting things is, you can tell about architecture often because of the user experience of the product. Not just that it's slow to release or difficult to deploy or those kinds of things, but if you think back to Web 1.0 applications, web apps didn't do anything unless you hit F5 to refresh, right? There was no reactivity, there was no kind of spontaneous updating of data, those kinds of things, and that was all kind of coming back to, well, here's the architecture, right? We make an HTTP request, we get back a bunch of stuff, we render into the browser, and then we stop.
People were in that box.
Yeah, so you kind of, oftentimes bad architectures will flow into the UI as well. And, you can tell this in mobile apps. If you look at certain pharmacy apps, for certain pharmacy companies with 3 letters that start with CVS, you can tell that this is a screen scraping mobile app, right? It's talking to some weird back-end system that they don't really understand. But
we're not judging.
We're not judging. It's difficult. We want to help you. But you can sort of tell, and that's really, that's telling, right? To coin a phrase, because that probably also means that the coupling that caused that sort of artifact in the UI is also going to cause all kinds of bad artifacts in your software pipeline, when you're trying to build, when you're trying to test, when you're trying to change, all of those kinds of things. So whenever, if it's causing problems in your overall flow,
that's a symptom.
It's probably also causing problems for your end users. Not just that they can't get their hands on the functionality because it's sitting in a corner of the factory parked for 9 months before you can ship it, but it just the architecture just makes it impossible to do a good job.
Right. All right. Excellent. So we've talked a little bit about this. Is there any such thing as a silver bullet to solving the architecture problem for greenfield, brownfield, bluefield, whatever? And let us start back with Mark Imbriaco. Mark, what are your thoughts on this one?
No.
Thank you.
I mean, that's the real answer. I say it for effect that way, but it's just a simple truth. It's complicated, right? when we think about, let's go back to architecture for a second. If we talk about architecture being about these boundaries and the interfaces between them, it doesn't matter whether your system's a monolith or whether you use microservices. Those boundaries exist. It's either separate components that have explicitly loose coupling, that have explicitly defined interfaces, or you've got a monolith that has, again, it's got components, it has services. Maybe they're called functions or classes instead of services. But there's still discrete components that, when you don't think about them, tend to be tightly coupled. So I think the silver bullet is just to stop and think, right? That's the only silver bullet is to stop and think real hard about the boundaries, right? Think about the boundaries between your components and how you want them to operate.
That'll never work. Do you have like a cheat sheet or something, or is there like
it says no, or it says it depends.
All right, yeah, all right. Well, I think that's a very appropriate answer. I loved you had me at no. As a matter of fact, so that's good. All right, Mick.
So I think the silver bullets obviously are not really there. So I think the key thing that I tell people who ask me this question, or our customers and so on, is to start out by modeling your value stream. This is actually kind of how Carmen and I met years ago. Is he showed me a model of his value stream, and I thought to myself, why on earth do other large organizations not have this? Because it starts the right conversations on where you should invest. And so I'll just give you an example of ours. I'm looking at it right here, and our value stream is all, it's obviously all modeled in TaskTop because it connects these systems. But we've got all of our work starts in either, and there's lots of dozens of different systems you could do this in, but starts in either desk.com, or in our product management tool and target process, or in Salesforce if it's a customer request. And that's connected to our road mapping and target process and our Jira, and then the deployment tools and so on, and support tools. And so once you model that, and once you see it, and it's interesting because there are two activities. One is to actually create the model, which is all the different workflow states in the different systems. We know, for example, if a customer makes a request or a customer has a code red defect, that will have a certain set of states in Salesforce. And as soon as one of those states transitions, we actually see that pop straight into the developer's backlog for that particular team. So that'll get actually rushed through. So we've got the an under 1 day lead time for those kinds of things if they're critical. But the neat thing is, once you've done that, and even at just a high level, even completely manually on your whiteboard or in PowerPoint, which is what Carmen had showed me initially, you've mapped that out, you actually start seeing the dependencies in your value stream architecture. So one might be, for example, that there's just not enough information on those tickets or on those feature requests and so on. So we've got a concept of a deal-breaking feature request where that thing also needs to be fast-tracked through. And a bottleneck obviously was that the person working with the customer did not provide any context on it, right? So that staffing up development would have done nothing if it didn't fix that bottleneck. Another one is, and I think this key one that we're talking about. So Mark, you mentioned that the parts and boundaries, right? If those parts include the way that the work flows in the different teams, and you start seeing the bottlenecks, some of them might be architectural, where this one team is just constantly needing to wait on API additions from a microservice, a backend service, or something. You actually start being able to see those kinds of things, and that all of these either defects came from that, or this inability to deliver a bunch of features or to fix authentication or something all came from that. So the really interesting things that I've noticed is once you start seeing the value stream architecture, you start seeing the things that are killing productivity there. And Carmen, you mentioned Dominica. I think I really liked her book, Making Work Visible. And one of the most important aspects of it is when you look at end-to-end flow and you start seeing that dependencies are one of your time killers, your killers of productivity. It really is those things that you need to model out in your architecture. Like the most interesting one we learned about a few months ago, actually, that I would have never guessed, is that for us to get features into a release, we actually need all the documentation enablement materials, which are done by the product management team that everyone forgets about, right? So, or they don't forget. I'm sure some people don't.
Customers don't forget about it, but right.
Our problem was that team actually tracks its work in, I don't know what, in email or in Slack, right? And so there's actually was no explicit dependency, but the engineers were freaking out because we're on them to get all the, one of the main things we measure is our velocity of features that go into a release, and they weren't able to close them because the enablement materials weren't there, and that's part of our definition of done, right? So bizarrely, creation of sales enablement materials became a bottleneck on what we were putting to releases, which we would have never ever, I think, realized if we hadn't, taken a look at the value stream dependencies and the dependency on that team, which is very easy to resolve when you do it, but not when you've got 1,000 engineers and you might have all sorts of different dependencies. And whether do you go after making sure that you're fixing that dependency, or just pouring a ton of effort into abstracting some common services and microservices, because you'll get more throughput there. So I think, again, first define your goals. Is do you need more feature velocity? Do you need better time to market? Do you need what do you need there? Do you need to take down technical debt so you don't go the way of Nokia, as you alluded to, Brian? And then map out the dependencies and figure out where to start. And that's really it. And sometimes I think for a lot of people listening, you will start at the software architecture, right? Especially if you're partway through the DevOps journey of doing continuous integration, continuous delivery. That could well be your bottleneck. So.
Fantastic. So I love that you're coming back to values. I could not say it. All right. Let's see. Brian, what are your thoughts on this? Is there a silver bullet?
No, I agree with Mark. No. But I think the reality is, in most of the businesses that we work in, if somebody says, hey, we'd like to improve, and your answer is no, there will be a line of 10 other people who will come along and go, my answer is not no, right? And so I think there's a reality that says, look, it's no different than every January 1st where we all look at ourselves and go like, I'd like to get in better shape. I'd like to lose weight. There's 10 different ways to go about doing that. So I think we have a tendency sometimes to sort of go, look, the answer is no, and you know what, you'd be wasting your time because you're never going to solve that problem. So only go focus on what's new. And for a lot of companies, they either that going to focus on what's new, they don't have the skills in-house to do it. They don't really know what that is. It's sort of like saying like, hey, if a venture capitalist offer you $10 million tomorrow, would you go start a business? Well, if you don't have an idea in your mind, then that answer is no as well, right? So
there's going to be 100 people who are willing to say yes.
Exactly.
Yeah, there are. But the other thing about it is, there are lots of ways to go about beginning to work around these things, right? Some of them are going to be financial, right? Like I am tied up in, for example, Oracle database contracts. I could move to open source alternatives. It frees up a whole ton of budget, right? That may be realistic. I may move certain, places that I have data, behind sort of data virtualization things that you do create that abstraction. And you say, I can start to think about the service boundaries like Mark talked about. So, is there a silver bullet? No. I think there's typically some amount of things that you can do to improve it. And then the question just becomes, are those things worth it? Versus the alternative of saying like, just leave it alone. It's going to get old and crusty, but that's fine. The opportunity to go do that new thing is what we're going to do. And if you choose that, then attack that with the same amount of fervor and budget and skills and everything to go make that successful, right? I think the reality is it's not a question of, is there a silver bullet? Can you half-ass anything and be successful at it? Half-ass the new stuff, half-ass the old stuff. I think the answer to that one's no as well.
Mm. But that brings up a really good point of where are you putting that priority, and is it about the things that are new and that are going to differentiate you, or is it about giving yourself a solid foundation for you to be able to build whatever the next thing is? And that's a thing that, look, if you have great architecture, if that's a conversation that happens between the business and the technology group. If that's not there, right, that goes back to good architecture. It goes back to good, silo busting, and like the fundamentals of this. I like both, please.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Excellent. All right, cool, Brian. Thank you, Randy. Is there a magic bullet, silver bullet here?
I wish there were. I've been searching for one my whole life and haven't found it. So maybe it's out there, but I don't know. So yeah, I really like a mixed approach to value stream architecture, and I'll generalize that to what is actually important. Like ask yourself basically what your problems are / what your opportunities are and solve those. So I will use slightly different wording and look at maybe a different dimension of it, but it's entirely compatible. So I like to think of it as either minimal viable architecture, analogous to, Eric Ries's minimal viable product in the lean startup, / evolutionary architecture. So every, big internet company, several of whom I worked for that you've heard of, have all started as a monolith. So they've all started as some retrospective piece of garbage thing that everybody hated, but guess what? That's what got them to this place. So, eBay is on its 5th complete rewrite of its architecture. Twitter's on its 3rd. Amazon spent, people don't remember this, Amazon spent the years 2000 to 2005 not doing great as a business, but retooling every bit of their monolithic architecture into something that, we now call services and microservices. And then look what happened, right? So the modern Amazon started at 2005, and then 2006 was the beginning of AWS, and I'm a retailer, so like the considerable march into like every aspect of selling you things that Amazon is being so successful at. Anyway, I think Jeff Bezos gets credit for lots of things, but doesn't get enough credit for this thing, which is seeing how important that architecture was at that moment. But as he would say, I'm sure, and that architecture was not appropriate when Amazon started in '95. Does it make sense? So that's the minimal viable architecture idea. And so to me, just because I can't help sort of categorizing these things, like if you think of a startup, and that could be an actual startup, or that could be a new product like within a larger company, there's sort of a initial phase that's kind of, I'll call it the search phase. Like, is there an actual thing that's worth building here? So is there a business model? Is there product market fit? And the moral equivalence of those things, within an enterprise. And there you're just experimenting, right? You're learning and you optimize for all that learning. And that's where the, lean startup ideas are really good. Then you're kind of in the, so now you've, found some initial customers and they're liking it. And so I'll call that the execution phase, where now you're just delighting those customers and you're going from, ones and tens of customers, maybe to hundreds and thousands. And then one hopes, knock wood, you're going to hit a scaling phase or a hyper growth phase, exactly. And then you're going from, maybe thousands of customers to maybe millions or tens of millions or hundreds of millions. And there are different architectures that are appropriate at different areas. And if you ask me what those were, super briefly, like in that search phase, it's no architecture at all, right? That's like Eric Ries has the wonderful idea of like, I don't know if there's a business here, but I'm going to buy some Google ads, like pretending that I have a business and see who clicks on them. Nice. So like those kind of growth hacky things are totally legit when I don't know, I don't have any customers and I don't know if I could ever have them, but maybe I could, and that's what I'm trying to find out. The growth phase, I think it's totally legit to be a monolith. Like, what's wrong with that? You don't know enough about your domain to break it down. You don't have a massive, hundreds of millions of people using your thing, so it's not about load. Hopefully, presumably you have a pretty small team. And then at some point, and like let's legit know that not every company or product is ever going to get to this place, but at some point there is that hockey stick hyper growth scaling phase, and that's where your monolith's going to run out of gas, and you got to think about another thing. And that was, again, Amazon 2000 to 2005. That was eBay, actually about that same period, 2000 to 2004, where they did a similar re-architecture, ... So you have to just ask, I think, what problem am I trying to solve? And then, and value stream mapping, as per what Mick was talking about, is a great tool to like actually see that and surface that. But the answer to the question is obviously there's no silver bullet, if only because there are totally different stages of company / product / team and very different, sort of appropriate architectures at those levels.
Right. Your comments remind me of a saying that I love, which is you build your first house for your enemy, your second house for your friend, and the third house for yourself. Because you don't know what you don't know when you build your first house. So you're going to put the light switch in the wrong place, and there's going to be a whole bunch of stuff that the foresight's not there because you just haven't had the experience. By the third house, you kind of know that you don't want to, put the light switch on the other side of the room behind the bar because you're going to end up tripping.
Yeah, there's actually a reference in Mythical Man Month. So from way back then, where there was a saying at the time, which was build the first one to throw away, something like that.
Right.
And I'm not sure I'd go all the way to throwing it completely away. And Fred Brooks has gone has a bit gone back on that. But the idea of in the initial, the key idea there is when I don't know what I'm doing, a prototype is the right level of investment at an area, a place where I can make really rapid experiments and learn that business model really quickly. Like that's what I should be optimizing for. And later, when I am maybe a mature business, like that's optimizing for radical changes in my business model. Like that's not what I should be doing. I should be doing other things.
So is it safe to say that in the beginning, and I'm sorry, I'm taking us maybe off track, but is the beginning, are you optimizing for finding failure more quickly? And then towards the end, you're optimizing for not finding failure or avoiding failure? Could that be
Ooh,
true?
I like it. I'd have to think about that. I guess I would say, I think there is a dimension that you absolutely put your finger on. I think there are maybe other dimensions, but to your point, absolutely. In the beginning, it's all about learning because I don't know what I'm doing. And then way near the end of that, life cycle, I do super know what I'm doing, and now I got to execute and keep executing.
Yeah, the constraints and the challenges change over time. Hopefully, otherwise you're kind of stuck.
Right.
So as those change, your architecture kind of has to evolve as well.
Awesome. All right. Thank you, Randy, and thank you, Anders. That'll be your turn. Carmen, we haven't heard from you yet.
Yeah, so, it's a great conversation. Made me think of a few things. I think one of the challenges that we give to teams is, we have this kind of we've had this kind of monthly release cadence, and we have some teams obviously that are able to do better than that and release much more frequently, daily. And so one of the things I say to teams is, it's going back kind of to Deming, is best what your value stream is, what your blockers are, what's getting in your way, right? Sure, there's the DevOps handbook, there's great guides, there's smart people like everybody else on this panel to listen to, but you have to take control of your own journey. So one of the challenges I say is, how do you get yourself out of this monthly release? Why are you in this monthly release? Right? And sometimes they're in there because they have a large batch size and they're dragged in there because this work is getting spread and there's all kinds of dependencies that emanate from the way the work actually is coming in, right? A lot of times those we talked about is from the architecture. They have to do things in concert with somebody else, and because they don't have that loose coupling, they're stuck going when this team's going, which is stuck with this other team, and it just keeps bubbling it up, right? Other times, it may be mindset, right? Seriously, you go to a team and say, well, why are you in the monthly release? And it's like, well, did I have a choice of not being in the monthly release? Because, that's just the way things are done, right? It's a big company. And I think going back to what Randy and what maybe other people have said, right? It's been successful, what Mark has said. So we're a Fortune 100 company. So obviously whatever we've done has made us successful. I always say there's two things around current state. One is you can't be overly critical because it's made a lot of people good money. It's served our members well, right? Paid a lot of insurance policies this last year. But then you also can't be, not willing, you can't be too defensive. You have to be able to be critical of it and drive continuous improvement.
Right.
And so a lot of times it does come back just to that mindset. And then I guess, going back to, what other people have alluded to and what Mark and Mick have talked about, what's the most important problem you have to solve, right? So is it speed? Then how can we get more speed, right? I mean, people sometimes say, well, I wanted some, what's the roadmap? Well, I don't know what your roadmap is. I don't know if it's more automated testing. Yes, you could go to the cloud, but if you take something crappy to the cloud, now you have something that's crappy in the cloud, right? I mean, that may not make it any better, right? I could drive a lousy car in the Autobahn, I probably aren't going to go any faster. So I just think having people understand, their own constraints and what's important to them, and then being able to help them with those countermeasures and that expertise. But they need to be able to first see and come to grips is, okay, what's the most important thing for me, given where we are and the business needs that we have.
Yeah, that's right. There are some comments. I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt you. Mark and Briaco made the exact same comment. I'm looking at the chat here. There is no silver bullet, but if you can't answer the question of what problem are you trying to solve, you don't even have a target. Randy mentioned a quote by Damon Edwards. That's just how we do things around here. I think it's classic. And then Mick, I think you had a point that you wanted to make.
Yeah, I just actually wanted to build on Randy's points. I think those are some really key points, and they bring up something really interesting. Carmen, you allude to this as well with, what's this team's bottleneck is the architecture that they probably know. So what's so fascinating to me is the companies that have realized that architecture was their bottleneck and the companies that haven't. And Randy, you gave examples of ones that had, where Twitter replatforming 3 times. I'm curious what Amazon would have spent on the re-architecture, right? That's 5 years. We're probably between $100 million and $1 billion invested, and it worked, right? And then I actually dug into a lot because I was around a lot at that time and working with Nokia at the time with the Symbian OS people, and Symbian, so that part of the organization, especially under Nokia, they did not realize that, and they were doing an amazing agile transformation and doing everything right, by the way. Every activity they were doing seemed great. All the Scrum consultants were in there, all the right tools were in there, and so on. Anything they could have done would not have worked, no matter how well and how much more quickly they did it, because they were on the Symbian Series 60 OS architecture would have never been able to keep up with the iPhone, even if someone handed them a capacitive touchscreen phone a year before I predict this, the outcome would have. So they didn't realize, and then it was interesting is that memo from Stephen Elop, coming from Microsoft, a company who has had technology leaders at the top, or actually has had technology leaders at the top, realized that the business could not move into its next stage. Whether it's from that
from yeah, which was, we didn't do anything wrong, but somehow we lost. Now,
that outcome was terrible too, to move everything to Windows Phone. So it's a convoluted story. But he called it. That platform could not have supported Nokia as in the way that mobile was evolving. And no matter what they did, if they didn't re-architect, which they didn't, and it was too late before the business noticed any of this, even though the business drove the right kind of agile transformation, the outcome was failure.
Right, and so, Marco just added, your architecture and your processes don't matter if you're not solving the right problem, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, right. But their architecture, even if they realized the right problem, they needed an app store, an ecosystem, and that mobile was this bigger thing, not just being good at building cool devices because they were building cool devices. It was too late. It was just too late.
They had every advantage. They had software that ran on a mobile device. They had the ability to make devices.
And all the James Bond movies.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. But I think it's very human. I think it's very human to want the silver bullet. We're going to look for that, and I think oftentimes we also mistake kind of language and tooling for architecture. If I'd only written this in Haskell, we wouldn't have these problems. Or if I'd only use Scala, we wouldn't.
Right. Exactly. And so and they will, and it is like those New Year's resolutions that Brian mentioned. But I think the really thing to me is that the companies that are winning, the big ones, they realize they know when architecture is a bottleneck. I don't know how Bezos, who's not a technologist, usually they have technologists at the helm, actually realized this and invested this much in it. That blows my mind. But they do, and I think for the audience, you should take a very close look to see whether architecture is your bottleneck, because when you read it, what we're hearing here from Randy and from others, when you reach a certain scale, it becomes one.
Absolutely. All right, very good. So we are running out of time rapidly. It's fantastic conversation. I'm going to skip a couple of the little topics that we had, and I'm going to go to best practices for pipeline architecture. So we've talked a little bit about the value stream. We've talked a little bit about the application architecture and the microservices piece, but what sort of information or insight can you share with the audience around best practices for actually making those pipelines more flexible and more robust? And let's start with Carmen.
Okay, so I think our approach has been, and we've been working closely with Mick, is to integrate our value stream, our pipeline across that IT for IT value stream and make work visible. So he referenced Domenica's book, and Domenica's book is focused mostly on, the Kanban and the line kinds of work, but really you need to make your end-to-end work visible. And what we found is you know, when we first implemented Agile, the work was very visible from story to end of iteration, but where it went after that and where it was coming from, you know, who knew, right? And so it was hard to understand what our bottlenecks were because it wasn't even visible, and we certainly didn't have any metrics on it. So I think our focus has been, and do it in a tool neutral way, right? So using, I'm going to plug Mick here a little bit, using something like TaskUp Integration Hub, where you can actually model your architecture. And then if you have Jira or RTC or GitHub issues or whatever it is that you're using, you know, whatever deployment, you know, Electric Cloud, whatever things you're using, right? You can see the work even through like the PPM, the portfolio system, all the way through deployment. Now, we're not all the way there, but just getting people to think about that, I think, you know, drives the right thought process. So, you know, that's kind of been the thing that we've been focusing on right now.
Yeah, Anders has another quote. I love to quote Anders, especially when he's sitting right next to me. Is that if you ask somebody how long it takes for them to deploy some new line of code into production and they say a couple of weeks, the fact is they probably don't even know how long it actually takes. They're just sort of guessing.
Most people don't know.
Yeah, most people don't know. Awesome. Okay, Mick.
More people know than last year, but
Which is good. All right, we're helping. That's why we're here.
Yeah, I think, you know, again, the big thing is look at, just building on what Randy said, look at whether it's your bottleneck, look at where you are in your life cycle. And I am also personally a big believer in this concept of minimal viable architecture, because you don't know what you should optimize your value streams for 3 years out, right? The market's changing, your business is changing. You might have, you know, it really depends what vector you're on and what vector those particular product and offerings are on. So I think, again, take this minimal approach, but then be ready and able to re-architect, and not just the code, the now legacy Java that you didn't write. That actually is too true. And you know, put a discipline and in place where you can re-architect that. Right, re-architect that. Whether you create these internal teams that do SDKs and APIs that can take some of that, or you have an internal contribution model of pull requests. But then I think the key thing is elevate it out beyond the code, because your bottlenecks and the things driving your architecture might come from people, you know, building new UX screens that you have, you know, no hope of implementing until you do a bit of replatforming and, you know, move it off of Bootstrap or whatever you need to do. So, yeah, I think. Again, start there and just be prepared to re-architect this, because it will become your bottleneck at some point.
Yeah, the whole idea of a minimum viable product. A lot can be said about a minimum viable pipeline too. You wonder why these guys who do this, you know, these cloud native applications, they have pretty simple pipelines. It's because the architecture of the application doesn't require a lot of dependency management, a lot of the weird stuff that all the legacy stuff requires. So if you can, you know, the minimum viable pipeline that you can build, as long as it serves the business need, again, going back to what's the problem you're trying to solve, simpler is usually better, right? So that's a very good point. All right, let's see. Brian, let's hear from you.
You know, I'll echo what a lot of everybody else has said. You know, visibility is important. Simplicity is important. You know, I've yet to see. There are always a million opinions about the tools around pipelines, whether you like CI or Jenkins or some other variant of those things. I quite honestly, like the customer base that I deal with is all over the place. That doesn't seem to be the thing. I think what we find is usually the tools they have are sufficient to make things happen. It's a matter of helping them use them appropriately. You know, typically it'll go back to we weren't organized well to deal with this. We don't have kind of process to deal with that. You know, we have seen some very good things from a technology perspective in terms of people using containers to sort of have a consistency around how they package things, around being able to test them locally, so they get some more immediate feedback. We find that has been interesting. And then we've actually seen running those pipelines on these sort of platforms that are built for dealing with spikes and so forth. So most folks will tell you their pipelines don't look like a 24/7 conveyor belt. They look very spiky and so forth. Instead of building out infrastructure to be able to deal with that and not using it very often, we've actually found people running it on top of these well-scheduled technologies like a Kubernetes or something get some benefit out of that. They can spike it. They don't have to think about it. So there's some, there's some elements in there that we've seen that have been helpful as well.
Yeah, excellent. All right, fantastic. Let's see, Randy.
Yeah, so I think our goal here is to sort of minimize the feedback loop. So like make sure that we have this tight, we'll call it cycle time or lead time, somewhat equivalent ways of thinking about it. I want to make sure, I mean, what problem am I solving with this pipeline? So I want to make a change and get it into customers' hands as quickly as possible. And then I want to be able to do it again and again and again. So that implies several things. That implies that it should be fast, end to end. So let's model it as a set of stages or steps typically. Like that's kind of what we mean by pipeline. And we go through and like, okay, I, test my code and then I deploy it someplace and then I, release it or whatever, turn it on, these different steps. And why am I doing that quickly? Again, because I want to optimize that feedback loop so I get my learning quickly. But also, again, it's back to the small batch sizes, single piece flow, a lot of these ideas out of lean manufacturing, which is, look, if I can do these smaller things, it's actually less risky. Like if I can deploy, it's better for so many reasons if I can deploy 10 tiny little things rather than one big thing. A, because 9 of those things have happened earlier than they would otherwise. But B, those smaller, like 1/10 size units are so much less risky because they fit in my brain as a developer. And so if something goes wrong, I'm almost guaranteed that I know exactly what it is. It's easier to roll out, easier to roll back. So like that's obviously the problem that we want to solve. And so ways to get at that are the things that everybody's talking about, which is, again, having a very clear like stage or pipeline, having lots of visibility into where this particular piece of work, this particular commit or change log or however you want to talk about it, where it is in that pipeline. Mm-hmm. And then it's obvious, but just to say more explicitly, we want it to be very easy to use for developers. So it needs to be push button. It needs to be resilient because lots of things are going to happen, potentially go wrong along the way, which is why people use tools instead of typically rolling their own. And then it needs to be kind of repeatable or reliable. And I think the best systems, the best systems that do these kinds of deployment pipelines have all of these, all those characteristics.
Fantastic. All right, very good. Mark, bring us home.
Sure. I'm so glad Randy talked about feedback loops. I wrote feedback loops in giant letters on my notes to make sure we talked about it because that's really what it's all about. I think there's a few other things that are interesting and important. I talked about this a little bit at DevOps Enterprise Summit, and one of the biggest risks to DevOps transformations is change control, right? This approval process kills us all the time, and we ignore it and pretend like it's not a problem. And we build all these fancy tools and we work on our pipelines. And then we build this pipeline and we scratch our heads and wonder why things aren't going faster. And then we actually do things like, I don't know, measure our value stream in our pipeline and figure out how long things are taking. And we discover that this is great. We can go from idea to code in like 2 weeks. And we can deploy that code in like 3 minutes after we get it approved. And it sits waiting for approval for 4 months. Did we really deliver any value by automating the pipeline at that point? I don't know. Probably not.
Right.
I would say probably not. So I think the first step is everybody's talked about this across the board is make sure you can understand how work flows through your system, right? If you can't understand, if you can't measure, you can't improve. And don't be dogmatic, right? Don't come from this place where everything has to be automated and spend 6 months automating one click just because your dogma said this thing had to be automated. You could have done a lot better, a lot more.
You have. Don't be dogmatic.
Yeah, you could have done a whole lot more with that 6 months instead of automating away one button press. My mouse is going to work for millions and millions of mouse clicks. I'm good. I don't need to spend 6 months on that, just because I said everything has to be automated. And kind of at the end of the day, the last thing around that compliance thing I'll talk about is make the pipeline make the right thing the easy thing, right? If you could do the hard work to encode that compliance behavior, for example, into your pipeline, and I talk about this all the time, encode compliance into software. If you do that, if you're able to make the right thing the easy thing, It'll drive adoption, it'll drive behavior, and everybody gets to move faster.
Yeah, that's absolutely.
That's a great point.
I love that. Yeah, we had another person on the show 6 months ago, a year ago, Mikkel Alvis, who said the same thing. You want the default state. If something falls, it should fall in a direction that is the right thing for people to do. And so you have to construct that. You have to architect that as part of whatever it is that you're making. So this is awesome. We got 1 minute left, Anders. Give us 1 minute worth of awesomeness.
Spend time worrying about this stuff, because it really, don't be dogmatic about it. I mean, to sort of translate a little bit of an analogy on one of the panels at DevOps Enterprise Summit on security, don't spend $1 million protecting a $5 asset. That doesn't make any sense. So don't have a giant, ginormous, architecture and stick to it for everything and thou shalt and those kinds of things. But architecture is kind of core. And I think, I forget who said it first, but these are the decisions that are difficult to change later on, right? And you have to be aware of that. And I think my goofy analogy for this is it's like a tractor pull. And for those of us that haven't been to a tractor pull, the key thing is that there's a weight on the thing that you're trying to pull, and that weight moves forward. And as it gets closer and closer to the back of your truck, the kingpin, it gets more difficult to pull. So you want to pull as fast and as hard as quickly as possible. And the longer you wait, the more difficult it gets.
Right.
And it's the same with architecture. If you have architectural problems, the longer you wait to fix them, the more difficult it will be. And that's unfortunately where I think a lot of companies find themselves in, is we've got the quote unquote legacy. And my New Year's resolution this year was to stop using that word, or at least in the unless it's in the context that it's untested code. But that's what got you dance with who brung you, right? That's what got you here. That's what made you some money and made you a successful company. And so you shouldn't, necessarily crap all over it, but you may have to fix it. You may have to evolve, because the conditions under which you made those decisions are different than the conditions today. And if you don't react to that, you go the way of the dodo, right?
Or the Nokia.
Or the Nokia.
All right. Awesome. Fantastic conversation, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next month on another C9D9.
Thanks, everyone. That was great.